Good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's event on Trump and the world economy. And it's my particular pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel of speakers. In the order in which they're going to speak, they are Jeffrey Frankel, who is Professor of Economics at the Harvard's Kennedy School, and he's also the director of the Program of International Finance and Macroeconomics at the National Bureau of Economic Research.
Sorry, I'm not doing that anymore. I stepped down.
Jeffrey will be followed by Brad Setzer, who is Senior Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations and a former high level of Treasury official and somebody who writes really a great blog. Mark Sobel, who is U.S. Chairman of the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum and formerly the United States Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund. I'll be the last speaker, and my good friend Alex Pollock will once again moderate the session. In assessing the new administration's policies, I'm reminded that Dennis Robertson, the late Cambridge University economist, never tired of saying that bad economic policy ideas were like going to the greyhound races. If you stood still long enough, the dogs would come around one more time. The new Trump administration seems to me to be going out of its way to validate Robertson's observation, with bad economic ideas coming back again in spades. One bad idea is a 25% import tariff on anything that moves. Another is the idea that the end of globalization would not be a bad thing. Never mind the unfortunate experience with the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Act, or with the last time that we had deglobalization at the end of the First World War. Never mind, too, that the last thing that we need now is additional fuel for price inflation. Another bad idea that the administration seems to be espousing is that the trade deficit can be reduced through aggressive import tariff policy, even if it is accompanied by a program of massive tax cuts. Never mind that such a policy mix of tariff hikes and tax cuts led to a 40% widening in the trade deficit of goods and services during the first Trump administration. Yet another bad idea that Mr. Trump seems to be embracing is that maximum pressure should be brought to bear on the Federal Reserve to reduce interest rates, even at a time when inflation is not yet fully under control. Never mind the risk that such an approach will send long-term interest rates higher, especially at a time when a gaping budget deficit is keeping our public finances on an unsustainable path. Needless to add, generating economic uncertainty by frequent policy reversals, as has been the case with tariff policy in the last few weeks, hardly contributes to economic stability. It also goes without saying that deporting large numbers of undocumented immigrants risks sending food prices and construction costs higher at a time when the Fed is yet to reduce inflation to its 2% inflation target. All of this raises a number of questions for the US and world economies that I have put to the panelists. First, how will US tariff policy affect the world economies, especially China and Europe? How might it affect the Canadian and Mexican economies? How likely is it that we'll have a US and world economic recession this year? The second set of questions are, how likely are these tariffs to help the United States reduce its trade deficit at a time when large tax cuts are being proposed? What sort of international policy coordination might be needed to improve the world's trade balance imbalances? Is the proposed Mar-a-Lago Accord to reduce the dollar's value a good idea? Third, what might be the implication of import tariff increases and large tax cuts for the inflation outlook and for the Federal Reserve's interest rate policy? How might long-term interest rates and the stock market be affected? Fourth, what are the longer run effects of deglobalization for the US and world economies? And finally, world debt is currently at close to an all-time record high. What might be the implication of higher US interest rates and of a US and world economic recession for financial market stability? So without further ado, I'll ask my good friend Alex Pollock to start moderating this event.
Thank you, Desmond. And let me add my welcome to our expert panel and to everyone joining us today. Desmond has already given us a lively opening review of the issues involved in the Trump administration's economic actions and proposals, notably tariffs, of course, trade deficits, effects on world trade, inflation, all happening in an era of very high world debt levels, and the questions on the role of the dollar. It also means, of course, questions about the global role of the Federal Reserve. By now, we and the world have already seen the opening salvos in retaliatory tariff wars, renewed discussions of recession. We just had one ourselves a minute ago before the conference opened, a sharp stock market correction, and gold trading above $3,000 an ounce. We talked about the reduction of the value of the dollar. Of course, with gold at $3,000 an ounce, it means that since President Nixon ordered the Treasury to default on gold redemption in 1971, the dollar has fallen from 1/35 of an ounce of gold to 1/3000th, meaning a 99%, almost 99% depreciation. Certainly an interesting development among many others. We've heard from the Trump administration discussions of a sovereign wealth fund for the world's biggest debtor nation, a very high political profile of cryptocurrencies, possible monetization of the Treasury's huge unrealized gain on its gold. And in short, we have plenty to think about. I have to add that as a student of financial history, I've always been especially fond of Desmond's story about the dog track and waiting for the ideas to come around again. Seems to me quite right. And of course, financial events also follow the same pattern, and booms and busts also come around again and again. And as a final note, Desmond mentioned the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. I used to keep in my office at AEI portraits of Senator Reed Smoot and Congressman Willis Hawley. And they were both obviously serious, dignified, and respectable men. They were trying to do the right thing, but in fact, they did the wrong thing. And this also is a pattern which comes again around the dog track. Today, our panel, which is excellent, I think, will guide us in how to think about what President Trump's directions mean for the world economy and what developments we may expect. Each panelist will speak for 14 or 15 minutes. We'll give each after that a chance to respond to the others or clarify points. Then we'll move to a general discussion, which will include questions from the audience, which you can submit electronically. And please see the instructions, if you haven't already, on the invitation from AEI for exactly how to submit your questions. And we'll move to our panel and begin our presentations. Jeff, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Desmond, for inviting us to this panel and for that introduction. I think this is shaping up to be a true disaster. I think it could easily be Smoot-Hawley or even worse. Now, that is assuming that the tariffs go into effect the way that Trump has promised, has on April 2nd and 25% and the rest of it, no exceptions. And I don't think that's going to happen. I think despite what he says, he's going to back off on some of those things. He may not know it yet, but that's my prediction. Nevertheless, it'll be bad enough that it'll have a big negative impact on the countries mentioned, on China, on Europe, on Canada especially, and Mexico especially. They'll be able to export less to us. That'll hurt their growth. They'll certainly retaliate. That'll hurt our growth. It's true that because our imports are greater than our exports, if they both cut back proportionally, that increases in net exports. But one shouldn't take solace from that. It's not really a demand issue. It's a supply issue. A trade war is a supply shock, and especially when brought under such circumstances as the current chaos with respect to trade policy and federal budget and everything else. It's likely to be stagflationary, to slow growth and raise inflation. The damage of any tariffs are threefold: raises the cost of living, raises the cost of inputs to firms to produce, and reduces exports. By reducing imports, it reduces exports, either by causing a foreign recession or appreciating the dollar, or retaliation, especially. And retaliation in this case is pretty certain. Especially on the 25% steel and aluminum tariffs and the 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico. When push comes to shove, I have a hard time believing he's going to carry through with all of it. I think we'll see more postponement, or he'll put it on and then postpone it for a while, and at some point declare victory based on not much and back down partway. But the damage will be there. In a normal year, the odds of a recession in the US are about 15%. I'd say in the coming year, they're triple that, about 50-50. It's not just the trade war. There's four other factors that could contribute to a recession. Crash of the US stock market, and the market was just very high at the beginning of the year and possibly still has a ways to go. Cuts in US government spending. Now, I don't think the cuts that DOGE has made are real. There's a lot of phony accounting, as has been pointed out, and my guess is that so far the real cuts that have been made are offset by the reduced revenue they'll get by cutting enforcement, particularly at the IRS. So we haven't yet made real cuts, but if they do, that would contribute to a recession if it's too abrupt and chaotic. U.S. fiscal crisis, on the other hand, running up against a debt ceiling. This last week, we just saw a narrow version of a government shutdown. So far, 2 out of 3 rating agencies have downgraded U.S. debt from AAA. Moody's is the one that hasn't, and I think they could well do that before long. The fifth one is perceptions of risk, both U.S. and global, which are way up for obvious reasons. And it's already reflected in consumer confidence and business confidence. It hasn't yet been reflected. These threats, the uncertainty, the risk, the chaos, hasn't yet been reflected in any numbers that we measure, employment rate or GDP growth, industrial production, or whatever. But I think that's coming, and it's telling that the Trump administration is already sort of saying, well, of course, there's going to be some pain. They're saying that even before it shows up in the numbers, which suggests that they maybe thought so ahead of time, even before the election. Okay. Tariffs will be inflationary. It'll continue to reduce the chance that the Fed will cut interest rates, which was the path they were on late last year. You might think that the Fed has to cut interest rates to combat the recession, but as I said, it's a supply shock, raising both inflation and a recession, and that central bank simply cannot offset or neutralize a supply shock. They don't have the tools to fix that. You can't fix a trade war. I think, to answer a question, we are vulnerable to a debt crisis, both in the U.S. and globally. Further fall in the stock and bond market. There were important steps taken after the global financial crisis to strengthen banking regulation and financial market regulation, but we've seen in recent times backsliding from that. We've seen a tendency to loosen financial regulations right at the peak of the financial cycle. Am I out of time? Alex?
Oh, you're good. You got another 5 minutes if you want.
Oh, I see. Okay, I heard a gong and misinterpreted it. Well, let me address the question about would deglobalization be so bad for the U.S. and the world economy? I think it really would. It's sort of old-fashioned to say so, and not so fashionable. But let me repeat some familiar history. The U.S. and Europe kind of went isolationist after World War One. So we had before Smoot-Hawley tariffs. We had high tariffs in the 20s. We went back into World War II, and both Wilson in World War I and Roosevelt in World War II campaigned on not getting into the war, but they were dragged into the war by attacks on Allied shipping, U.S. shipping, and by the attack on Pearl Harbor. After World War II, we thought we'd learn our lesson, that we can't just let the rest of the world go its own way, because sooner or later we'll have to deal with it. So the U.S. helped guide the formation of a multilateral international order with the United Nations and first the GATT and then the WTO, and I would count NATO as part of that. And that gave us 70, 80 years of relative peace and prosperity. And I think everybody tends to forget how this is completely unprecedented in history. As far as I know, there's never been a time of such relative peace and prosperity. And it could go away again easily. And I think globalization and some multilateral rules to govern international trade and international interactions are an important part of that. And we're throwing it away, and we're throwing U.S. leadership away voluntarily for no reason. All right. What else do I want to say? Well, just a Mar-a-Lago Accord, I was going to leave that to Mark and to Brad. I'll just say that I don't think it's a real thing. I don't think it's a serious thing. There's a lot to be said about it, but I don't think it's serious. Same for the sovereign wealth fund. Same for the idea of having a crypto stockpile. I mean, these are just fantasies and unlikely to take place. And if they did take place, would not serve a purpose in my view. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jeff. Brad? You got to turn off your mute. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. I should note that Desmond inflated my role at the Treasury and forgot to mention that Mark was actually the true senior Treasury official for a very long period of time, and I was at best a junior Treasury official, completely under Mark's thumb. So I'm looking forward to what he has to say on the Mar-a-Lago Accord, and I'm going to leave it to his great experience to figure out if there's any merit whatsoever in the proposal. What I thought I would do was actually start a little bit with what Trump did in his first term. Actually argue that it didn't have as big of an impact as was expected at the time, and contrast that with what he may do in his second term, which I actually think could have the big negative impact that didn't materialize out of his first term actions, and try to explain why. So if you go back to a lot of the analysis when Trump won the 2016 election, and even more the analysis when he went beyond just not going forward with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and moved into actually initiating a meaningful trade war with China, the Section 301 case that actually started off over like 50 billion in tariffs, and then it escalated and escalated. There was a sense that that was going to end an era of globalization. This was an epic turning point in history, that the U.S. had backed away from a policy of increasing integration into the global economy. When you look at the details of what happened subsequently, that isn't quite what happened. Desmond alluded to that when he mentioned the fact that the trade deficit actually continued to increase under the first Trump term. Fiscal stimulus and the Trump tax cuts and the demand growth that induced overwhelmed the impact of the tariffs. But there's, I think, other lessons to be learned. The first lesson I want to highlight is that there are factors other than unfair trade policies and even other than the dollar that impact trade. One is tax policy. It's a little bit my bête noire. But one thing that Trump did at the beginning of his term, which actually pushed the trade deficit up, was sign the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Now, why would tax cuts increase the trade deficit? Well, the tax cuts actually created multiple different tax rates. One 21% rate on ordinary American profits, another 10.5 on global intangible profits. Now, if you're an American company and you can transform what would ordinarily be US profits taxed at 21% into global intangible profits taxed in the US at 10.5 net of what you pay abroad, a typical corporate executive is going to be looking to see how they can get in the 10.5% tax bracket. And that's exactly what happened with the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry, by placing its intellectual property offshore, which it has long done through various means, and by producing pharmaceuticals offshore, adding to the trade deficit, can move its profit outside of the United States and thereby change what would ordinarily be a 21% tax to something closer to a 10.5% or maybe a little bit above tax. So what you actually see is not an end to globalization during the first term. You see an acceleration of some of the least healthy forms of globalization, those forms of globalization that are designed to get around paying tax. U.S. imports of pharmaceuticals broadly have more than doubled and are now $250 billion a year, mostly from low tax jurisdictions like Ireland, Singapore, and Switzerland. The trade deficit in pharmaceuticals is now $150 billion a year. And America's biggest 6 pharmaceutical companies report losing money in the US, making money abroad, and pay all of their tax. Collectively, the top 6 companies only set aside money to cover foreign tax. They didn't set aside any money to cover US tax. Point being, globalization is propelled by multiple forces. One is tax avoidance. And if you're not careful, you can design tax systems that encourage unhealthy globalization. Now, Trump seems to want to solve these problems, which he partially created through the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act with tariffs. And I think that's actually, there's an argument that it might work. It's not the most efficient way of reining in tax-fueled globalization. But if your choice is between essentially paying a tax of 20%, assume you can't pass it on to the consumers at the border because of the tariff, and reorganizing your tax arrangements so that you're not importing from Ireland at an artificially high price, some companies may choose to not import from Ireland at an artificially high price. So I think that, we have to be a little bit conscious of some of the complexities of globalization and conscious of the fact that some forms of globalization have been unhealthy. The best solution, though, as always, is to deal with the underlying distortion, which in this case is the US tax code. The second sort of surprising outcome of Trump's first round of tariffs, and frankly, I don't think anyone fully anticipated, I certainly didn't, was that it actually did not reduce China's role in the global economy. We fight a trade war with China. The general assumption would be that that would, at a minimum, make Chinese exports a bit lower than they otherwise would be. The US was a big market. China had become somewhat dependent on US demand. But what you actually see in the Chinese data is an enormous acceleration in Chinese export growth after the start of the trade war. Chinese exports are now up about $1 trillion, several percentage points of China's GDP after the start of the trade war. Net exports have contributed 5 percentage points or so to China's growth, which is actually a big number in the years after the pandemic. Why? Well, I think the key lesson is that bilateral tariffs actually have a modest impact on global trade, and in some ways can induce more trade. How do you get around a bilateral tariff? It's actually pretty easy. You ship the parts, the components to a third country, say Vietnam, say Thailand, say, frankly, Taiwan. You assemble the parts in the third country. That is a shift in tariff code You put in a couple of screws to make sure that you're doubly safe, and that entered the U.S. tariff-free under the WTO's traditional trading rules under the standard U.S. tariff schedule. So what you see in response to the tariffs is an increase in Chinese exports to, say, Vietnam, and an increase in U.S. imports from Vietnam. More trade, not less. And you don't see a deglobalization of the Chinese economy. You see China actually reglobalizing. But the second important factor that was relevant here was that the policies of our trading partners actually have an impact on our trade outcomes. Not a shocking revelation, but China went through the COVID shock like we did, but it didn't do a lot of direct support for household income. We did. And so when we're supporting household income and China is not, we end up importing more even with the tariffs. Moreover, China's economy went through a grueling real estate correction, which has slowed China's growth quite significantly, made China much more reliant on foreign sources of growth, and actually pushed China's aggregate trade surplus up quite a lot and pushed the export share of China's economy up. Point being, generally speaking, it is often easy to kind of make first order forecasts by looking at the direct impact of the tariffs, but the end results can be a bit complicated. And the end result of the initial Trump tariffs was a big reduction in bilateral trade between the US and China, a big increase in trade with Southeast Asia and Taiwan, frankly, no change in the trade deficit, or maybe a slight increase because of the fiscal policies, and an aggregate increase in China's reliance on exports, not because of the US tariffs, but because of developments inside China's own economy. And frankly, a big increase in China's trade surplus with other parts of the world, like Europe, like some places in South America, like India, where there's also a bit of a reaction against China's trade. Now, why do I think that this may not be all that good of a guide to what happens in Trump's second term? First observation, and I think this is important to just quantify things, is that the core trade war in Trump's first term was limited to one country and one sector. The one country was China. The one sector is actually a double sector: steel and aluminum, metal, traditional metal manufacturing. In magnitudes, the just pay it cost of those tariffs were maybe 0.4 of a point of US GDP. The second Trump trade war, which may actually not be a trade war, it may just be a move towards tariffs, is shaping up to be much bigger if Trump does a fraction of what he has proposed. The tariffs that were proposed on USMCA trading partners on their own would have been about 0.7 of a point of GDP in just pay it costs. So close to 2 times the size of the trade actions done against China in the first term, because we didn't cover all of China's trade. We covered like 2/3 of China's trade, and part of that was at a low tariff. You throw in the additional tariffs on China that have already been put in place, and the threatened actions in early March were close to a percentage point of world GDP, of US GDP. And if you look forward at some of the actions that have been contemplated to countervail the impact of value-added taxes, to countervail all potential non-tariff barriers, to countervail currency undervaluation, to set up something which will be called the reciprocal tariff, but in no way will match other countries' tariffs, you could imagine a global increase in the US tariffs of 20 to 25%, which would be in just pay it cost over 2 percentage points of GDP. These actions are, if implemented quickly, would be bigger in aggregate by far, 2 or 4 times bigger than the trade actions of Trump's first term. And those were staggered. Those were put in place over time. So just in magnitudes, the changes are much bigger. It's actually way bigger, way bigger than the Nixon shock in 71, which was just a 10% tariff on trade, which was under 5% of GDP at the time. So you're really looking at quite big shocks that, if were actually implemented, would have a much, much larger effect on us and on the world. And if you think of them in sectoral terms, the sectors have gone from steel and aluminum to autos, to pharmaceuticals, to semiconductors, even forestry products. I'm not quite sure how you fit that into national security tariffs, and I'm sure others. So we're moving to a world where the tariffs are much, much more comprehensive, much, much harder, frankly, to get around. No company can be confident that if you leave China and go to Vietnam, you're not going to be hit by a tariff. And as a result, I think that if Trump goes forward, the impacts will be multiple times bigger. I actually think in this case, as opposed to the past case, big enough to meaningfully alter the direction of globalization. And Desmond, maybe even bring down the trade deficit, not for healthy reasons, but because the tax associated with the tariff may actually be bigger than the tax cuts associated with Trump's budget policies. We don't know yet, but if you do maximalist tariffs, the tariff revenue is not trivial. And you might induce from a fall in demand, a bit of a slowdown that achieves your goals, not because of good trade outcomes, but because of a compression and a slowdown in the US economy. Very last point, going back to one of the points I made earlier, what other countries do in response matters. And one of the things that is seemingly happening, maybe only partially because of the trade threats that have been levied against our allies and Europe, and including Europe, but also because of the defense policy shifts, the lack of commitment to NATO, concerns that the U.S. is not committed to even assuring a modest outcome in Ukraine commensurate with Ukraine's success on the battlefield, is that Europe's fiscal policy has shifted. And that shift abroad is actually positive for the U.S. and could help in a healthy way over time bring down the U.S. trade deficit. If China is really committed to expanding consumption now, and I'm not sure it is, that too could be healthy. Point being, think about what the U.S. is doing, but also remember that our trade partners have a vote. Some of their actions are going to hurt us, the retaliation, but some of their policy responses could help. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Brad. And thanks very much for the great reminder that whatever you do, somebody else reacts, and then other people react to that, and your own citizens and companies react to that. And that's the web to think our way through. Thank you. Mark.
Well, thank you for having me today. I have to thank Brad for his kind words and note that he wasn't so junior. And even if he were junior, that didn't mean he was silent. So I'm going to focus on.
We believe that one, Mark.
I'm going to focus on two questions that you formulated. What sort of international policy coordination might be needed to improve the world's trade imbalances? And is the proposed Mar-a-Lago Accord to reduce the dollar's value a good idea? So in my Treasury days, I had a major hand in preparing U.S. positions on currency matters and the G7 and G20 finance tracks. So I'm going to start paradoxically answering the coordination question. As Brad knows, I told the great Treasury team, do not use the word coordination in any memo you expect me to sign. And remember the old Treasury dictum, coordination is what you do to the other guy. So to me, coordination means country A tells B and C it will do X if they do Y. And it doesn't really work that way. Maybe if a gun is held to financial authorities' heads, as was the case during the global financial crisis, they will do so. But normally they cooperate. They may act similarly if hit by a common shock, but often their cyclical positions or monetary and fiscal policy stances differ, and they pursue their self-interests. And so that relates to the Mar-a-Lago Accord, which I'm going to call MALA from now on. And first of all, one needs to define MALA. And two interrelated definitional approaches I've seen are, one, MALA as a macroeconomic accord patterned on the 1985 Plaza Accord, and two, MALA per a recent Stephen Myron piece about restructuring the global trading system, a topic that AEI senior fellow Stephen Kamen has written a great deal about, including a little bit with me. And there's a nice piece in the Financial Times Alphaville on this topic. So Mala pattern on the Plaza Accord is infeasible. I understand the analogy. The dollar soared in the mid-'80s. Reagan cut taxes and increased defense spending. Volcker was strangling inflation. Interest rates soared. The dollar surged. This generated huge protectionist pressure and is when the term the Rust Belt gained traction, leading Secretary Baker to craft the Plaza Accord. So blame the messenger and not the underlying policies. Currently, the U.S. runs huge fiscal deficits. The Fed has raised rates quickly in the past years. Interest differentials in the G3 space have favored the dollar. So that boosted the dollar. The real trade-weighted dollar is extremely strong, though not as strong as at the time of Plaza. Jack, could you throw up the slide if possible? And as during the Plaza period, and now the U.S. needs to raise national saving and others needs to boost domestic demand. So you can see how strong the dollar was in 1985. There's a peak around 2002, but right now it's getting back towards the Plaza level. So this is the end January real numbers. It's come down a bit since then, but you can see that the dollar is very strong. You can take the slide down. So the environment for economic policy making is different now than in the mid-'80s. Plaza was a G5 macroeconomic deal to lower the dollar via intervention and fundamental actions to boost domestic demand overseas and for the U.S. to cut its budget deficit. So the five were the U.S., Germany, France, UK, and Japan. The ECB didn't exist. Canada and Mexico, a quarter of our trade, weren't at Plaza, nor was China or other Asians. Fed, ECB, and BOJ independence is entrenched now. They target inflation, not exchange rates. They don't believe intervention has a lasting impact unless accompanied by fundamental changes. They are free floaters, though Japan dabbles occasionally. Especially today, with Congress playing a leading role on fiscal policy, how can the U.S. executive make credible fiscal commitments, let alone with huge tax cuts likely in the offing? So coming back to my skepticism on coordination, countries are loath to subordinate domestic objectives to an external discipline. Cyclical positions vary. So unless Trump's growth scares overwhelm the economy, the Fed is likely to be on hold at this time. Europe is stagnant. Inflation is coming down. The ECB has been cutting. We'll see how much farther it may have to go. A European fiscal stimulus could perhaps push up rates and support the euro. Maybe Trump's alienation of Europe and casting down on U.S. security assurances and the potential swing in Germany's fiscal outlook may alter the picture. Japan has its own issues. And that brings us to the bull in the China shop. Again, China wasn't at Plaza. The RMB isn't a market-determined currency. China could engineer an appreciation, for example, if it sold $1 trillion of reserves. But why would Xi do that? Despite a huge current account surplus, it faces massive economic headwinds, including deflation and capital outflow. It's already been staving off depreciation to some extent. China isn't part of the Western security structure, has a dim view of Plaza, as does Japan for that matter. I'd imagine Xi is wondering whether it makes sense to do a deal with a mercurial Trump. He wouldn't wish to be perceived as caving to Trump or fear Trump would then declare victory over China. And then further on the dollar and trade imbalances, the U.S. current account deficit largely reflects our saving investment gap. Big fiscal deficits drive that imbalance up, plus relatively higher U.S. rates attract capital, as I mentioned. So yes, it takes two to tango on currencies, and others do excessively save and or engage in harmful currency practices. But if Trump wants a lower dollar, the best thing to focus on is not coordination or an accord, but to cut our fiscal deficit. Despite the fog from Scott Bessent's 333 proposal, it's a sui generis proposal, I must say, and Doge cut chatter, tax cuts will drive deficits up. I should add that an absurdly wrong-headed way to get the dollar down is to create growth scares and recession vibes and cast doubt on America's reliability as a trusted partner and weaken the underpinnings of dollar dominance. So bottom line with respect to a Plaza-type mala, let's primarily look in the mirror and get our house in order rather than blame foreigners and shoot the foreign exchange or inbound messenger. But mala has taken on new meaning given Stephen Myron's November paper on restructuring the global trading system. Myron argues our trading partners should lower the dollar, working with the U.S., and provide long-term financing to the U.S. or face the threat of higher tariffs or loss of the U.S. defense umbrella. Others, less friendly, could face different kinds of unilateral acts. So I am not a fan of the Myron paper, to put it mildly. Myron's piece suggests the dollar's global role is bad for America. The attractiveness of the U.S. economy and financial system does draw in capital and boost the dollar. I think in that sense, the dollar can be seen as overvalued, subsidizing consumption and taxing manufacturing. But the dollar's global role is a net plus for America, not an exorbitant privilege, as the rest of the world believes, nor an exorbitant burden, as Myron suggests. Interest rates may be a bit lower. Americans are shielded from FX risk, and we get some seigniorage. We have leverage via financial sanctions. And as Jeff Frankel once told me, Americans have a built-in edge as English is the world's lingua franca. The idea all countries should have balanced current account positions is ridiculous. Those positions are impacted by a range of structural factors. I think the IMF estimates the U.S. current account norm is 2% of GDP deficit. However, the U.S. current account deficit is pushing 4%. That's not 2. Why? I'd argue that while others' sins are part of the story, in large part, it's because our fiscal policies are out of whack. Myron's piece has little to say about fiscal policy. And again, our deficits will head upwards with Trump's tax cuts. Also, our trade deficit provides a partial off-ramp for activity that could otherwise cause overheating and inflation. Trump world believes tariffs can usher in a U.S. manufacturing renaissance, putting to the side retaliation. Manufacturing is less than 10% of our economy and workforce. The decline in U.S. manufacturing is a long-term secular process seen elsewhere, and a key driver of that is technological change. Trump's call comes across at times as a seeming quest for autarky. Now, for myriad other reasons, the Myron plan won't work, in my view. As noted, absent fundamental changes, FX intervention isn't likely to be effective in lowering the dollar. Plus, if foreigners sold treasuries to pay for intervention, it might push up U.S. rates. I can't imagine any reserve manager turning out into 100-year zero coupon bonds, let alone involuntarily so. That strikes me as antithetical to the openness of U.S. capital markets and protecting the safety and liquidity of U.S. treasuries, which are key underpinnings of dollar dominance and the very reserve currency role the Republican platform said it was intent on preserving. The openness of U.S. capital markets is especially needed now, as we need to finance our massive deficits. Frankly, the 100-year zero coupon proposal reminded me of my days in Treasury and the IMF, and sovereign debt discussions about so-called, wink, wink, nod, nod, voluntary reprofiling and whether credit rating agencies would view these as a selective default. So let me wrap up. Some countries do save excessively and or have kept their currencies down, but we in the U.S. aren't innocent and should probably stop blaming foreigners for our trade deficits, instead focus on getting our fiscal house in order. That would probably help lower the dollar and reduce our trade imbalance. That's a far preferable course than protectionism, tariffs, pursuing autarky, and believing a restructuring of the global trading order is needed. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Desmond.
Thank you, Alex. I'll propose to go through a few slides, that might provide additional support for things that have already been said. But I also want to talk about how Trump's policies, are likely to affect the global economy. So let me start, just by saying that there are sort of 3 ways that I think that Trump's policies can impact the rest of the world. The first is what happens to the U.S. economy itself. It's been said that when the United States, as the world's largest economy, catches cold, the rest of the world gets pneumonia. So we should really look at what the policies are likely to do to the US economy. If the US economy performs poorly, that in itself is going to be pretty bad news for the rest of the world. Then, we've got the issue of the tariff hikes. If you put 25% tariffs on countries like Mexico and Canada that are highly dependent on your market, that is very likely to sink those countries into recession, but it's also going to be bad news for Germany, export-intensive economies elsewhere, Germany and China, just to mention two. And the third way that the United States can affect the world economy is through financial flows, that if you've got high interest rates in the United States or you've got financial market dislocation, that can really mess up financial markets abroad. And I think that so far, what we've been talking about is really Trump's tariff policies. We should mention that there are also very big tax cuts in the offing. And those tax cuts really can blow out the budget deficit. They estimated to be anywhere between $5 trillion and $11 trillion over a decade. So we're already starting from high budget deficits. So I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the tax cut proposals that are being floated. So let me just talk a bit about how I see the Trump's policies affecting the U.S. outlook. The point I'd make is that the economy is already slowing. This chart brings home that consumer confidence is really slumping at a alarming rate. And that has got to do with the way in which policy is being conducted, the chaotic way. There's so much uncertainty. People don't know what's going on, both with respect to the tariffs as well as respect to the cuts in Washington. So people are being freaked out. They're pulling back on consumption. This looks pretty clear. And the same thing with investors are complaining that there's no way that they can make investment decisions if they don't know whether the tariff's going to be 25% or it's going to be zero, it's going to be on this product, it's going to be on that product. There's no way you can make investment decisions. So that is cooling. You see it in the GDP Now numbers, put out by the Atlantic Fed. They're showing that you could have a decline in the first quarter of already 2%. So I think that the Trump policies are already having an impact, a negative impact on the US economy. And the longer that we have this uncertainty, the more this occurs, and that can be pretty bad news. What's also striking is that the Trump policies aren't doing too much good for inflation expectations. And that's got really puts a restraint on the Federal Reserve as to whether the Federal Reserve can come to the rescue. So what we're seeing is the Michigan survey is showing that 1 year inflation expectations of households now is 4.9%, not 2%. So that is not a good indication. Just to put this point of the budget deficit, because I think that that is really an important point and can have long-run impacts if Trump goes ahead with the tax cuts, gets them through Congress. I think that the U.S. economy and the world economy is in deep trouble. These charts just show what would happen to the debt to GDP ratio. We're already at 100%. Before you even look at the tax cuts, the CBO was warning that by 2034, we're going to be at 122%, which is a level higher than we were at the end of the Second World War. If you take the Trump tax cuts into effect, we could be at like 140% of GDP by 2034. So there's a real problem here of debt sustainability. And I don't buy the argument that the United States is different. When you're on a track like this, that is trouble. Just to repeat the point that Brad has made, the the Trump first term, this chart just shows what happened to the trade deficit. You see that it increased. There was something like a 40% increase. If you look at the current account deficit during the Trump term, it went up from $480 billion to $680 billion. And my view is that the reason that that occurred was precisely, what Mark is saying, is that the trade deficit, forget about the level of tariffs or any other things you do, so long as your savings is short of your investment, you're going to be running a trade deficit. And what the tax cut basically did is it incentivized investment and it reduced savings. So little surprise that even if you put the tariffs on, you're going to get a trade deficit. And I'd say that the same thing is occurring here. So long as Trump goes ahead with massive tax cuts, he can do what he likes with the tariffs. If those tax cuts swamp your receipts from your tariff revenue, you're going to get a widening of the trade deficit, not a narrowing. And we're already at a high level. Just the last point, just in terms of the way in which the economy is performing, this chart, just brings out the difference between what occurred during the first Trump administration and what's occurring now. And if you look 120 days after the election, in the first Trump administration, the stock market increased by 10%. Here we're declining by 5%. I think for me, this might be a saving grace. This might be the thing that triggers the U-turn that gets Trump to back away from policies that would otherwise lead us to a really unfortunate outcome. So let me just move on to the world economy and just make the point that all of this poor policy decision by the United States is occurring in times of a troubled world economy. So, we've got China is in the midst of a bursting of the mother of all housing and credit market bubbles. Their economy is struggling. GDP is decelerating like crazy. You've got the country suffering from deflation, that they're on the cusp of real deflation. So the last thing that they need is a shock, coming from the United States. I would just say that Germany is in recession. It's been in recession the last 2 years. So European economy is not that strong. The positive thing that I can say about Germany is they've got rid of the debt brake, so you might get some relief, but we'll see that in 2027. The other point that we've got is we've got a debt problem, a real debt problem in Europe, that we really can't afford to go into a global recession with France and Italy having real debt problems. Their debt levels now in relation to GDP are much higher than they were in the 2010 debt crisis. So that's another point of weakness. The other thing that's occurring, with these poor policies on the United States is that we've got a bubble, it seems to me, in the stock market. If you look at this chart, on the left-hand side, the tech stocks look like they were at the time of the 2000 dot-com bubble. The overall market, the same thing. So you've got extremely stretched valuations. You can't afford to have interest rates going up or the economy going down. You could really get a very nasty movement on the stock market. And as I said before, Trump seems to be going out of his way to get the market to do poorly, by engendering so much uncertainty into the outlook. One thing that I should also mention, just in terms of the US economy that's not discussed very much, but I think it's very real, is you've got a commercial real estate bubble that is in the process of bursting, and that there's been a lot of extending and pretending, but there's so long that this can go on. This chart is just indicating on the office space, that the delinquency rates are already going through the roof. We're back to where we were like at the 2008, 2009 great economic recession. So in short, this isn't a good time to be getting policy wrong in a major way. As I mentioned, the tariffs are the last thing that the export-intensive economies need. China, in particular, needs to have export growth. Otherwise, how's it going to get out of its problem? That they can't have yet another shock to their economy. Germany and Canada and Mexico, all of those are export-dependent economies. They can't afford it. This chart just shows, just underlines the problem for Mexico and Canada. These are hugely trade-dependent economies. You're just seeing the levels of trade. If you add exports and imports and divide it by GDP, something like 70% in the case of Mexico, not much less in the case of Canada. And all of the stuff goes to the United States. That this chart just shows that 78% of Canadian exports go to the United States, 80% of Mexican exports go there. So 25% tariff on these countries is a serious deal, that would sink those. This chart from the Peterson Institute just indicates, what they think this could do to Canada and Mexico's GDP. That this could be a hit. In the case of retaliation, Mexico, it could be 3 points of GDP. So we're talking about serious stuff in terms of recession. The last point that I want to make, which I think is an important point, is that the recession abroad is not a good idea for the United States. That if the United States forces these other countries into recession, that is really bad news on multiple fronts. The first is that it hits our export sector. Export sector can't do much. But what strikes me as well, I think that this point is worth bearing. This chart just indicates the amount of revenues that our companies derive from foreign trade, from overseas operations. So, if you look at the S&P 500, you could be talking about something like 40% of between 30 and 40% of their revenues derive from abroad. So it's not really in our interest to sink these economies. That'll have a bearing on the stock market. So in short, I'm not too enamored with what the Trump administration is doing. I think that they're playing with fire, that this can have real impacts for the global economy. The only 2 points I want to leave on a note of optimism. 2 points are that if the stock market falls another 10%, my bet is that Trump has to walk back all that he says. I've got in mind, what happened to Liz Truss not so long ago in the UK. When the gilt market went, they had to make a U-turn. Trump won't be the first politician who'll be disciplined by the markets. This time it won't be the bond market, it'll be the stock market that'll be doing it. And the other note of optimism that I've already mentioned is that Germany might be engaging in a big fiscal stimulus, which could be good news. So Alex, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Desmond, and thank you to all the panel for a really interesting set of discussion points and issues that we have to consider. I'd like to go back through the panel. Maybe we could get this last screen down. Last slide off our screen here.
Oh, sure.
And
Sorry.
Go back to featuring ourselves. Thank you. Thank you, Desmond. I'd like to go back through the panel and give everybody 3 or 4 minutes in the same order that you all just spoke, to reflect on what other people said or add things of your own thoughts. And so, Jeff, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I agree with almost everything that my fellow panelists said. Let me highlight 2 or 3 points. On the question, will the tariffs reduce the U.S. budget, U.S. trade deficit rather? I think not. I mean, one is the point about foreign retaliation hitting our exports almost as much as our imports. But the main thing, as others have said, is current account is equal to national savings minus investment. Trump has proposed enormous tax cuts. Desmond says $5 to $10 trillion over the next decade. I mean, to remind everybody, Trump's platform is to renew the giant tax cuts that they passed in 2017, and people are expecting that. He promised during the campaign to eliminate taxes on Social Security, on tip income, and what was the third one?
Overtime.
Yeah. And now they're talking about with these huge savings, which are non-existent from Doge cuts, giving rebates to people and paying down the debt even. I mean, it's all fantasy. And one thing I will take a slight exception to, Brad kind of leaning over backwards said that maybe the tariff revenue would be so large that it would outweigh the tax cuts. But that's not going to happen. I mean, it's just the magnitudes are way off. So tax cuts, budget deficit up, national saving down, current account down. On the Mar-a-Lago Accord, it's supposed to take inspiration from the Plaza Accord of 1985. It's similar in that the proposal is to do it at a fancy hotel that Trump is associated with, that its response to the U.S. trade deficit, and it's bringing down the dollar to hope to improve the U.S. trade deficit. Differences, our allies are not going to cooperate this time, number one. Number two, there's this steps taken to prevent U.S. interest rates from rising, like requiring foreign central banks to trade in their treasury bills for these 100-year bonds that wouldn't pay interest until the end. No reason why they should do that. And if we do it unilaterally, that's restructuring is basically a default. And an effort to prevent the depreciation of the dollar from impairing the dollar's role as a #1 international reserve currency. Trump clearly wants to keep the dollar's role as #1. He's threatened tariffs against the BRICS countries if they move away from the dollar, especially if they start their own currency, which is not going to happen. But it shows how much he is committed to a strong dollar, and that's just intrinsically contradictory to the Mar-a-Lago Accord as it's being discussed. And then finally, I thought it was a 50-50 chance of a U.S. recession, and same for other countries in the coming year. What about a world recession? There's no generally agreed definition of world recession. It's very rare that world GDP actually falls. Sometimes we talk about a world recession as being when world GDP expands at less than 2%. Sometimes it's when the advanced countries have an absolute decline, and both of those are substantially more likely than usual.
Okay, thank you. Brad, reactions to others or more on your own thoughts?
I guess I'll have a few reactions. First, I wanted to emphasize a point that was implicit in one of Desmond's graphs. And Desmond, by the way, it makes everyone else look optimistic when he runs through all the problems with the global economy. You kind of wonder how we managed to survive the last 5 years without a major recession, given all these structural problems. But there is this unusual developments on the U.S. trade accounts, which showed up in the January number where the trade deficit just blew through the roof, just like back to the levels of 2022 when the ports finally unclogged and goods finally solved the supply crisis. That's weird. And I think it's just a symbolic representation of the uncertainty created by the threat of all these tariffs without clarity about which ones are going to go into place and at what rate. A lot of that surge was actually imports of gold coming actually via Switzerland because of a fear that gold might be tariffed. And if gold were tariffed, you couldn't hold gold in London as a hedge against your US gold derivatives, ETFs, and the like. So people had to move physical gold from vaults in the UK, remelted in Switzerland, according to the FT, and ship it to the United States. And in the process, we got this huge increase in the trade deficit. There was also a bit of tariff front running. Perhaps some pharmaceuticals from Ireland, perhaps some imports from China. But you actually didn't see tariff front running from Canada or Mexico. So there's likely going to be even more distortions in the rest of the Q1 data as everyone tries to get around the possible tariffs. So we're going to get some unusual and strange results, which to me just symbolizes the uncertainty that Trump has created. No one knows what the tariffs are going to be on April 2nd. The incentives to front run are enormous. You don't know what's safe, what's not safe. And I do think that that's going to layer on an added negative impulse to the U.S. economy beyond the direct impacts of the tariffs. Second point, you know, the unique thing about the second Trump trade war is that it's not very well targeted. What do I mean by that? There is a case that China has been a little bit of a bad actor in the global trading system. Unusually unbalanced domestic economy that China hasn't successfully changed despite persistent complaints over the past 15 or 20 years. Very aggressive industrial policies that basically make it very difficult for firms looking to make a profit to compete in sectors where China throws subsidized capital into that sector after sector. But to the best of my knowledge, there's no compelling case that that Canada systematically discriminates against U.S. goods. There's some problems on dairy. That's it. A little bit on timber. But Canada runs a balanced global trading relationships with the world, and we actually have a manufacturing surplus of a rather substantial magnitude vis-a-vis Canada. They're simply on Trump's own terms. There is no case for 25% tariffs on Canada. Canada is about the best trading partner you could imagine if you want to revitalize American manufacturing, and fighting a trade war with Canada will lower manufacturing output, not increase it. So if you're going to fight silly trade wars, I think that adds to the risk that you're going to get bad outcomes. Third point, where I may differ just a bit from Mark. You know, Mark said the dollar is very strong, and I would agree, and maybe not quite as strong as it was in 84, 384. We can debate that. Its impact will be bigger now because the U.S. is more integrated into the world than it was in the early 80s. But to me, there's a striking statistic that more people should be focused on, which is that if you look at U.S. exports of manufacturers defined using the SITC data for consistency, and you look at U.S. exports of agriculture, and we have a trade deficit in agricultural goods now, and people tend to think that's protectionism, blah, blah, blah. No. Agricultural deficits are a function of strong dollars. The U.S. can't compete with Brazil and Brazilian soybeans and Brazilian pork when the real is where it is and when the dollar is where it is. Our exports of ag and manufacturers as a share of our GDP are back to their levels of the early 1980s. Our exports of manufacturers and agricultural products are 2 to 2.5 percentage points of GDP below where they were 10 years ago, or after the global financial crisis when the dollar was at a different level. So I think there's actually fairly substantial evidence. And by the way, our income balance is shifting into a permanent deficit now because of some of the fall in the foreign profits, and then our interest bill is rising because, well, we are the world's biggest external debtor. So I actually think there's a pretty compelling case that just says the stock market maybe is a bit overvalued. The dollar's more than a bit overvalued relative to the underlying external fundamentals of the U.S. economy. And so measures that would bring it down would actually be, in my view, somewhat healthy. Agree with Mark that The core of any adjustment has to be a more reasonable fiscal balance, hopefully done not just on the backs of cutting Medicaid and foreign aid, but in a more balanced and fair way. But I also think we've reached levels of valuation. This is where I think there may be something to a narrow definition of the Mar-a-Lago Accord, one that leaves out the crazy 100-year bonds at zero rates, which for a country like Japan that actually marks their reserves to market would mean their reserves would basically disappear. It's just not going to happen. But if you think of a more narrow agreement where Trump holds back on at least some tariffs, and the U.S. joins with Korea and Japan in joint intervention to push their currencies, which are historically weak, up. I can imagine that working. I mean, Japanese interest rates have come up, particularly at the long end. Korea is reconsidering its national pension service outflow and hedging more of it. There is a fundamental basis for thinking that there could be a stronger won and a stronger yen if the tariff threat were modulated. And I think similarly with China, if the Trump administration, and there's no sign of this, was willing to limit the tariff increase in exchange for a substantial appreciation of the yuan, I actually think they could do that without spending $1 trillion of reserves. If you create expectations that the yuan is not going to depreciate, given the magnitude of China's trade surplus now, which is way bigger than it was in the past, and if you push Chinese exporters to repatriate some of their offshore dollars, I think you could actually get the yuan up and have a dual equilibrium type situation with a stronger equilibrium that wouldn't put a lot of pressure on China's reserves. But the core of that bargain is a very narrow deal. China appreciates, the U.S. limits its tariffs, and there's no sign as of yet that the president is willing to limit tariffs.
Thanks, Fred. Mark, comments?
Thank you. Maybe just a few staccato reactions to things I've heard. So first of all, on fiscal, just to echo Jeff and Desmond's comments that our deficits are high, debt is high, and much of what we're hearing from the Trump administration will make things worse, and that the Doge is more talk than substance, putting aside the chaos of it. I find Besson's idea that we can have 3% potential growth and 3% deficits to be ridiculous. So I want to agree with them on that. Obviously, recession odds have increased. Whether they're 50-50, I don't know. I think Brad's point about tariff uncertainties makes it all a big guess is correct. I thank Jeff for his reaffirmation of the post-World War II era and underscoring and reminding us what could be lost here. Brad was talking about pharmaceuticals and whatnot, so I want to tell everybody he wrote a great CFR blog the other day on this topic, and I highly commend it to everybody. I thought it was even better than the always outstanding Setzer blogs. Since somebody mentioned this, these ideas about crypto reserves and Bitcoin reserves, just to say how I find it so odd that we would be touting tools that are used for criminality and money laundering, and that others would tout as an alternative to dollar dominance. Sovereign wealth funds were also mentioned by a few, I think by Jeff and Alex. Again, a lot of focus on, well, how would it be financed? We don't have oil revenues a la Norway. We don't have the big savings of the Singapore and whatnot. But even apart from those kind of questions, nobody seems to be talking about, well, what would the money be used for, and what would the governance arrangements be, how transparent would it be, et cetera. And I think those are important issues. China, I very much agree with the observation that domestic demand has been suppressed, and because of that, China has increasingly relied on the external sector. I don't see it committed to a fundamental overhaul of its economy towards consumption. Some of the analysis I've seen about the latest policy developments coming out of the National People Congress and some of the talk about fiscal stimulus, they don't seem very bold and ambitious to me. In contrast, I think what's going on in Europe is potentially quite interesting. Not only with Trump raising security questions and the talk about greater defense cooperation and whatnot at the beginning. The German fiscal discussion I find very fascinating, and we'll have to see if it holds traction. But as somebody who spent years complaining about Germany's excess savings, creating a deflationary bias and having adverse ramifications for European growth and adverse spillovers to global growth, this is definitely something that bears watching. Desmond reminds us that financial markets may react to this set of policies, and that may be one disciplining force. We will have to see. I don't see much discipline coming from anywhere else these days, unfortunately. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mark. I couldn't agree more with your point on the sovereign wealth fund. Not only the irony of it coming from a debtor nation, but all of the very real and gigantic governance issues and questions about why you would want the government running a big investment fund. It's a really profoundly huge problems. Desmond, comments?
Yeah. Well, the way I see things is that this policy uncertainty is really causing a lot of problems both to the economy and the stock market. And I don't see that dissipating anytime soon. That even if you get something on April the 2nd that they back off, for a period of time, you're still going to have the uncertainty there. So I think that is ready, you might have already set in place a dynamic that is going to be very difficult to stop. I mean, the good thing about the stock market is that unlike congressmen, they can't be primaried. These guys are going to be figuring it out on, whether or not it makes sense. What is the profit outlook and so on. So I think that I see the stock market as having great potential, to restrain Trump, because there's already people around him. I can't imagine that Elon Musk is too happy about his stock price being down 40 or 50% in a short space of time. I would say the rest with the others would be concerned. So I think there'll be huge pressure on Trump to kind of get some sort of order into this, if we get the stock market occurring. Just on the question of the dollar, I think that dollar realignment, currencies coming back into better shape, would be very helpful. But Jeff will remind us, when I learned about international economics, I thought there was something about switching and reduction, expenditure switching and expenditure reduction that had to be combined. So until you get the budget in shape, you're not going to get any progress on the deficit. That all that would happen, at least in my mind, is if you weaken the dollar and you don't reduce the budget, that looks to me like a sure recipe for inflation. So you better get the fiscal part right, or else you're in trouble. Jeff, did I get a good grade?
Yes, A+.
Okay. I'm reminded that apparently Rubin, when he was Secretary of Treasury in meetings with Larry Summers, he'd the whole time turn to Larry Summers and ask him what his grade was on what he just said. The last point, the two more points. The one point that I think is really very scary about this whole thing is that if we do have a financial crisis, who is going to be leading us out of this financial crisis? You know, you've got a government now that seems to have total disregard for the international economy, that doesn't seem to have any trust. Traditionally, what occurs in financial crises, global financial crises, is the United States provides the leadership. It's the only country that can provide that leadership. We're in deep trouble if we do have a global financial crisis with an administration that doesn't believe in international cooperation. The last thing I wouldn't mind if Brad just elaborated a bit more about China, you know, and I think it's important, you know, that China being the second largest economy in the world, you know, what happens in China is really got consequences for the rest of the global economy. You know, and it seems to me that they've got a real problem with the housing and credit market deflating. They don't seem to have scope, or they don't think that they've got scope on the budget side. And now we're cutting out the export side, you know, that either the United States putting tariffs or the Europeans are going to get very upset about the dumping that is occurring. You know, how does China get out of its current predicament? Or put the question differently, I just wonder whether Brad thinks that China is in for a lost economic decade, Japanese style.
Ed, why don't you go ahead and take that up while we're on the topic? You have to take your mute. You're muted, Brad.
I'm not sure that China's in for precisely a lost decade in the same sense that Japan was. I mean, Japan was already, you know, a much wealthier country when its housing bubble burst. It was already a fully urbanized country, and China is still only a partially urbanized country. So I think there's still a few underlying sources of growth in the Chinese economy. But what I do absolutely think is that China is in for a very protracted slowdown. And I think actually that slowdown began during COVID. We thought it was tied to COVID, but it will actually turn out to be a function of the bursting of the property market bubble and the difficulties getting out of the property market bubble. What China has relied on, and I think relied on much more than shows up in the official data, because I think in the official data, particularly last year, domestic demand was probably inflated a bit relative to its true level. And net exports, which officially contributed 1.5 percentage points to China's growth, was an enormous number. But if you look at the delta between import volumes and export volumes, that was over 10 percentage points. Exports are 20% of GDP. So I get a contribution of closer to 2 when I look at the data. You know, there's always problems with the Chinese data, and it's always a little fuzzy. So my sense is that last year, China basically grew on the back of net exports. I'm not sure they cannot continue to grow somewhat on the back of net exports. They're still getting, you know, import demand is stalled. Export growth was still 5, 6, 7% in the first couple of months. And it will take a bit of time before other countries react as the US has reacted. Europe will eventually probably follow with tariffs, but it's not going to come immediately. The Europeans follow the rules. So I'm not sure China won't continue to get a little bit of growth. But what China has to recognize is that the amount of growth that China can get from the rest of the world cannot sustainably be 1.5 to 2 percentage points. It probably can't even be 1 percentage point, which is the average over the post-property crisis bust. At best, it's a couple of fractions of a percentage point, which either implies much slower growth in China or a lot more pressure on China to adjust policy. The one thing China hasn't done yet, which it obviously should do, and maybe is preparing to do with the recapitalization of the state commercial banks, which is part of the latest plan, is it really needs to clean up the balance sheets of the property developers, convert debt to equity, do some triage, close some of the developers, make sure that the pre-sales can be completed and that you deliver on your promised apartments. But basically create financially healthy property companies and allocate the financial loss from the property market crash. That hasn't been done. The IMF says it needs to be done. I fully agree. The other component of a successful response to me, and this is where I differ from many, is I actually think China still, including frankly parts of the IMF that I think are thinking about this wrong. I think China still has fiscal space. People always talk about the overall levels of debt in China's economy. That's not, to my way, the right way of thinking about fiscal space. The right way to think about fiscal space is to ask, does the central government of China still have fiscal space? The central government of China has debts, formal debts of under 30% of China's GDP. It has financial assets, and they're real financial assets. The state telecom companies make money. They're monopolies. The state oil companies make money. They're monopolies. The state grain and oilseed importing companies make money. They are monopolies. Those are real financial assets. The net debt of the central government, according to an IMF paper, is close to zero. And when I do the bailout cost from the local and provincial governments that would accrue to the central government, and the bailout costs that accrue to the central government from the financial system, I get net debt levels of the central government that are no worse than Germany, that make China look relatively strong. So to my mind, the key to China getting out of its current trouble is to actually think a bit of rethink central government fiscal policy in the way that German government rethought its fiscal position. Germany needed to invest more. It needed to invest more in defense. China doesn't need to do that. China needs to do more to support its household sector. It needs to collect more than a percentage point in GDP and income tax and then reallocate that so that it is not relying on regressive taxes that take money out of its highest propensity to consume households. There is so much untapped policy potential, in my view, to support a stronger growth of household demand that China could do a bit better. But so far, I agree with Mark. It's kind of danced on the edges. It hasn't really taken the key steps. So I'm looking at, not no growth, but not much growth.
And that'll have a huge impact on commodity markets, and the emerging market outlook could be impacted.
The weird thing about China is that you always think they're going to pivot away from investment, yet they always find a way to juice investment. And somehow we haven't yet had that, commodity price collapse. You have some familiarity, I think, with the Australian economy and iron ore. And, it really hasn't collapsed. Why? Because steel output still hasn't collapsed. It's, partially because China is exporting a lot more, and partially because all the steel, and this is like kind of literally true when you look at the investment numbers, all the steel that used to be put into building apartments is now going to building new factories. The increase in manufacturing physical investment has been extraordinary. And I think there is a question of what happens when China's has to slow down all the investment that's going to build new electric vehicle capacity. They're going to saturate their own market for autos this year. And they're just expanding at a pace where in 5 years, they're going to be able to meet all, not just demand for EVs, autos in Europe and the US. I mean, it's just sort of a crazy expansion of capacity that's using a lot of steel, but it clearly can't go on. So I agree with you at some point. There will be a correction in commodities. I just have learned that just when you think China can't invest anymore, China finds a way to keep on investing more.
But
China did, of course, learn an interesting lesson learned by many people over many years, that building empty buildings is a bad way to invest.
But what Brad's saying
Counts as
about
GDP. I'm sorry, Desmond, go ahead.
What Brad's saying about China investing in manufacturing, could that exacerbate trade tensions, and give fuel to the tariff war?
Absolutely. I mean, look, my baseline was that Europe was going to have to react
Correct.
no matter what Trump did, just because the impact, the US in a sense has been insulated from what I call the second China shock, partially because, we closed off our market to autos from China. Really did. And so we haven't had the influx of Chinese autos. We haven't had the benefits of cheap EVs either. So we've been insulated there. And then we don't export as much as Europe does. We don't export as many manufacturers or kind of the traditional engineering sectors as Germany does. And so we haven't seen the downturn associated with China's expansion into these sectors in the way that Europe has, nor have we seen the imports that Europe has. I mean, Europe's importing as much from China as we are, way more cars. And I don't think that was tenable. Germany was really suffering. Export market share, exports as a share of GDP going down, and imports, China's just taking an increasing share of the European market. There was going to be an adjustment. Brazil, which exports iron to China, was re-importing that iron as steel. Brazil got worried about the displacement of domestic auto manufacturing from Chinese EVs, and it reacted with tariffs. So yes, there is a reaction. That reaction is not just limited to the U.S. It has been more modest than the reaction in the U.S., a little bit more consistent with traditional trade rules, but it was clearly coming. And the Europeans are rightly petrified at the possibility that if the U.S. walls up vis-a-vis China, all that capacity flows to Europe, and that really causes problems.
Jeff or Mark, a chance to comment anything on China and its role in the shifts that are coming here? Jeff?
One quick observation. Is China going to undergo a lost decade like Japan? One of the unique things about Japan's lost decade is it lasts 30 years. And my view is that the strong growth in China is gone permanently. The slowdown is much of it is permanent.
Thank you. Mark, any thoughts on that?
I basically agree. China's sustainable growth rate is going to head much lower. Demographics alone would suggest that. And in addition to all the imbalances in the economy that have to be dealt with, such as the housing woes. I won't say excess debt because Brad is here, deflation, things of that nature. So, and I have to say, one of the statistics that totally shocks me is that China's manufacturing surplus is over 10% of GDP the last time I checked. Brad will know. And, I find that a staggering statistic, which points very vividly to how investment driven the economy is and how the resources are being still grossly misallocated.
Thank you. I'd like at this point to switch topic a little bit. Desmond mentioned financial crisis. Jeff, in your comments, you said with all the changes we've been discussing, we are vulnerable to a debt crisis. To what extent, as we look forward to the tariffs, to retaliation, to perhaps stagflation, to the China problems, what are the chances we're looking at some kind of financial crisis, either internationally or in the U.S.? This is a serious risk we ought to be. Well, and Desmond also mentioned our own real estate problems, at least in commercial real estate. Jeff.
So U.S. debt to GDP is pretty much at its record level of 1945 and increasing at an unsustainable rate. If we were any other country, the risk of a serious debt crisis would be substantial. Hard to say for the U.S. because it is unique how the dollar, despite everything that's happened, it's still the world's leading reserve currency, safe haven currency, and the world seems to have a limitless demand for holding Treasury securities. But I can't believe that that'll go on forever. So I think there is a real risk. And the budget process in Washington, which has been broken for a long time, is just, if anything, getting worse. I think we could really see a fiscal cliff, maybe the next debt ceiling, or mention of possible downgradings of by the third credit rating agency. So I think that a debt crisis is quite possible. And given that the financial markets, as others have said, have been so high, the stock market's been so high, there's a lot of room to fall.
Other comments,
Can I add?
Mark?
Yeah. When I think about this issue, I think we have, 100% debt GDP ratio. And so let's say over the next decade, it goes to 135, 140. And then I think, 140, look at Japan, look at Italy, France, we're the US. That's probably financeable, even if it's bad policy and absolutely the wrong trajectory. But then I have a second thought, which is we're going to be running something like 7% of GDP fiscal deficits per annum. And I think that's a lot of paper for the market to absorb. And it's especially a lot of paper for the markets to absorb if we're casting doubt upon our global role. And the other thing is, market structure's changed. It used to be you could offload tons of paper on the banks and the primary dealers. That's the ability to do so is restricted these days because of market dynamics and whatnot. So a lot of asset managers, pension funds are buying up the paper, but the market dynamics may be a bit different. So and then I think, when I think that, I think, oh my goodness, we could be facing a lot of volatility in financial markets. Whether it's a crisis, I don't know. It could involve substantial upward pressure on the term premium and longer term rates. And, I have this fear that if we don't change course, we may start to see serious incursions on we'll see fiscal dominance, and we'll begin to see some serious incursions on Fed independence. So none of this is a good idea. I'd like to think we should at least stabilize the debt to GDP ratio or bring it down very gradually in a way that isn't disruptive to the economy. But we're certainly headed on the wrong path, in my view. And I don't mean to sound like an uber hawk. I'm not. But more, I just would like to see some gradual reduction in the debt to GDP ratio that doesn't really hurt the economy. I would wish our politicians would get together and raise revenues and slow the growth in spending. I don't see that happening, so that's why I fret bond vigilantes and things of that nature.
Mark, right on your own experience, the last time around of the last decade, Fed bought $5 trillion of mostly long treasuries. You think they're going to do that again?
I differentiate between quantitative easing and, having to do so in a fiscal dominant situation. We will see.
Thanks. Go ahead, Desmond. I know you want to get in on financial crisis.
Yeah, well, I think that when we've considered financial crisis, we shouldn't limit ourselves to what might happen with public debt. That there's a problem with regional banks, that they would seem to me to be very exposed. So I'm struck by some work done by Paul Kupchak in AEI, who's taken a look at the balance sheets of the regional banks and seen that they're sitting on mark-to-market losses, with something like a $1 trillion handle because they bought treasury bonds at very high prices, very low yields, and the yields are at 4% and rising. So you've got that loss, and then they're also hugely exposed to commercial real estate. So we go into a recession and we have high interest rates. You could get real strain in the banking system that nobody seems to be paying attention to.
Jeff mentioned stagflation as a possible outcome, and that would go along with troubles like you're talking about, Desmond.
Yep. But just if the administration beats up on the Fed, and tries to get them to reduce interest rates, won't we see a repeat of what we've seen over the last 6 months? That the Federal Reserve has reduced interest rates by 100 basis points, but Treasury bonds have gone up by 100 basis points. So, you can have control over the short-term interest rates, but if you mess around with the short-term interest rates and the market gets into its head that you're off to the races on the long-run inflation outlook, what they're going to do is they're going to dump their 10-year Treasury bonds, and that has all sorts of consequences. So, I think it's very dangerous to begin messing around with the Federal Reserve.
Thank you. Brad, you want to add anything on the financial crisis before we move on here? No? Okay. Let's come back to the fiscal problems. Mark, you said it all, the most important factor looking all through this is that we have to cut the federal deficit. You talked about that a little bit in general, but you want to say anything more specifically about how you would recommend that be done? And then we'll give anybody else a chance who wants to weigh in.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, I have nothing profound to say. I kind of think we're an economy that collects central government 17% of GDP or so. We spend about 24%. Let's try and, get our deficit down to 2-3% of GDP. Let's raise revenue up to 19-20, and let's slow the growth of spending a little bit. I kind of think we are an undertaxed country, and there are a lot of things that can be worth looking at. We haven't had a gas fuel tax increase since 1993 at the pump. We look at estate taxes, look at marginal taxes and whatnot. Social Security, lift the cap. I spent a lot of time at the IMF. I've seen other countries do far more draconian things. Though I think our problems are solvable if we would just have a little bit of political compromise and sanity.
Yeah, they're solvable, but we're going in exactly the opposite direction. That's what we're doing.
Yes.
We're starting with
tax cuts the wrong way.
We started with a 6.5% of GDP budget deficit, and we look like we're going out of our way to try to increase that to 8. So I mean, this is kind of like it's very disturbing. Like I said before, it's not just the tariffs that are disturbing. It's what is being proposed on the budget that has to be of equal concern. If you take the two together, I don't see how we're not in trouble.
This fits with the happy role of world reserve currency. You can do that more, at least for longer, under current circumstances. Jeff, did you have a comment?
I was just going to observe that there is real grounds for this pessimism about whether Washington will do the right thing on the budget. The disconnect between the rhetoric of politicians who say how important the deficit is and the debt, and we need to pay it down, completely unrelated to how they're willing to vote on spending and tax policy. I mean, we've been seeing that for 40 years, but 45 years. But now they don't even bother to say, well, you see, when you reduce tax cuts, economic activity will increase so much that tax revenue will go up. That's what they used to say. It never worked. Didn't work in the early 80s. It didn't work in the early aughts. It didn't work in 2017. But now they don't even bother to say it. They just say we're going to look at all the crockery we're breaking. And look how impressive that is. It must mean we're really serious about fiscal conservative, about bringing down the budget deficit. But they aren't at all. And I don't see any prospect of that changing.
No comments on this one. It's a huge issue, of course. Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, I have a few observations. One is that, we usually think of our debt as the federal government debt, the fiscal debt, but U.S. external debt, I mean, the big change, one might say, over the past 15 years is that U.S. external debt has gone up to about, net 50% of U.S. GDP. It fluctuates a bit depending on the mark to market of foreign bonds. And that was sort of workable in a world where there was a lot of demand for dollars because, Germany wasn't spending, European rates were low, Japanese rates were low, and we were financing that at a relatively low real rate. We are increasingly financing it at a higher, at least nominal rate, and arguably now getting to positive real rates. The average interest rate on U.S. external debt, you have to do some adjustments, is still under 3%. Lags are significant. There's some arbitrages between the type, the U.S. collects a risk premium by buying foreign corporate bonds and selling treasuries, but that's shrinking over time. And one could reasonably worry that if we end up in an equilibrium with a 4 to 5% long run nominal interest rate, that's a meaningful increase in our external debt burden, and that rather than being stable, that external debt burden is going up. And I do sort of worry about that when we have an America First policy that's kind of threatening not just China, but our allies in unprecedented ways. You can think of the proposals for the 100-year bond as one such thing. You can think of threatening Canada's independence as another. And you sort of see some reactions in Canada to the effect of, if the U.S. is going to threaten us, why are Canadian pension funds investing so much in the U.S.? And I think you can imagine if the U.S. threatens Denmark over Greenland, that you could see similar reactions among some of our bigger European creditors who have large government pension funds. So I think we have to be a little bit cautious that we don't undermine the financial basis that has allowed us to support this large external debt stock at a relatively modest rate.
You said, Brett, excuse me, just there, you said 3% nominal, which is basically zero real versus current inflation.
Yeah, it was like a little bit positive real.
A little bit slightly.
Yeah.
You're saying it could go to a significant positive.
Yeah, I mean, one would think that that might be, if you have a fiscal deficit that is putting sustained pressure on the long end, you're going to start having to pay positive real interest rates. I mean, that would not be a surprising outcome. And we are used to a world where our external and our domestic debt dynamics are stabilized by a very favorable real interest versus real growth dynamic. And we sort of projected that forward, and maybe that's a little risky to do. The second one is, look, I don't think any of these changes give you the tax revenue you need over time. I agree basically with Mark, although I think 3 to 4 is a more reasonable level. But there are some very basic things that we have not done to collect more tax revenue in a more equitable way. And I'm afraid the Trump administration, because of their ideology, isn't even thinking about them. We've not, and maybe the Trump would change this. We haven't changed carried interest, which is a giveaway to private equity fund managers. It's not a ton of money, but it's symbolic. It's symbolic about equal burden sharing and everybody paying their fair share. Research assistants for private equity guys, people like me, pay a lot more tax than the fund managers. It's just unfair. The other unfairness is that a lot of major U.S. international companies are increasingly not paying any tax in the United States. The top 6 pharmaceutical companies, as I mentioned before, set aside 0 out of their global earnings to pay tax to the U.S. Treasury in 2023 and 2024. All their taxes being paid to foreign governments. Apple is likely soon going to be setting aside more out of, and forget the legacy commission ruling about Apple's tax structure before 2014. Out of current earnings, Apple will soon probably be setting aside as much to pay Dublin as it pays to Washington, D.C. That's just the structure of the taxation of major, very profitable U.S. companies is not generating tax revenues in the U.S. There are reforms that could change it, but it requires going back to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and fixing some of the international provisions that have had perverse impacts. And then you have to do some of the hard stuff. Last point is, I actually think there's much more uncertainty about Trump fiscal policy than most do, and a little bit about direction. Extending the tax cuts is not a positive fiscal impulse. It does have implications for the fiscal path because, no change to the underlying fiscal deficit and a rising interest bill means a bigger fiscal deficit over time, but it's not a positive fiscal impulse. We have some possible positive fiscal impulses: no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, some of the inheritance tax stuff, which I don't think has a big fiscal impulse, but has enormous budget costs, which could push that to being push that up. But I take somewhat seriously the notion that the Trump administration, when it talks about an external revenue service, isn't joking, and that we may have an inefficient but real fiscal consolidation through a tax on the imported component of consumption. So to me, it's a little still unclear about the fiscal impulse. And I think the risk for the Trump administration is they go full forward on the tariffs. You get the negative fiscal, the tax hike from the tariffs way ahead of any of the positive fiscal impulse from whatever comes in a budget deal. So you could throw the U.S. economy into an early recession just because of the timing.
And just to
which
say,
is-
Brad and I could come up with a nice fiscal tax package, I think, and both of us would not be cutting the IRS in half.
Right.
Yeah, shooting
Okay,
yourself
thank
in the
you.
foot.
Let me, with all of these issues on the table we've talked about, let me come to a question which has come from the audience and just see if anybody wants to take this up. The questioner feels like we have had an uneven playing field in the global economy and the trade system, and that these need to be normalized. He says, is there any way to do that other than through disruptive change? Is there any sort of normalized change, or are we fated to disruptive change like what we've been talking about? Anybody want to? That's a question from the audience. Anybody want to comment on that? Are we fated for disruption here?
I mean, I'll
On the level,
go ahead, Jeff.
it's on the level playing field. I mean, in the aftermath of World War II, we did let imports in pretty freely, lower tariffs in other countries because it was good for everybody, all concerned. But for Americans to say that China or other countries are violating international trade rules just ignores the fact that we're violating international trade rules worse, more clearly, more consistently. And I think that we need to face that kind of before we can diagnose the situation.
So let me highlight three different sectors, which I think illustrate different questions about this level playing
You got to
field.
do it, hey Brad. You got to do it in not more than 2 minutes.
Okay, so first, there are sectors like pharmaceuticals, where the global norm is zero tariffs and where our trade deficit is 100% a function of our own policies. There are sectors like autos, where we protect light trucks very heavily, not so much cars. But the notion that we're not exporting to Europe because Europe has a 10% tariff ignores the dollar, and it ignores the fact that American automotive companies are not making cars suited to a market where you need much smaller cars to fit through smaller city streets, and where gasoline is taxed at 4 times the level of the US, so you need to prioritize fuel efficiency. Europe could bring its tariff to zero, and it wouldn't lead to a surge in U.S. exports to Europe. We're misleading ourselves. But finally, I do think that China has been a bad actor. It's not just technology transfer. That was the complaint of 10, 20 years ago. China's built its EV industry not on tech transfer, but on tech development. It has built its battery industry on industrial policy and tech development, but it has clearly relied on protectionism and industrial policy. It doesn't import cars. It never allowed Koreans to import batteries. It has been unfair, and I'm open to fighting and pushing hard on China. What I just don't understand is why we're fighting Canada.
Thank you. All right, we're down to about 6 minutes to go here. I'd like to give the panel a chance for a parting shot. Any summation you'd like to make or final point? We have maybe a minute or a minute and a half each, and we'll go in the same order. So, Jeff.
Well, returning to where we started on trade policy, if Trump goes ahead on April 2nd with everything he's been saying, it's just going to be a disaster for the world economy and for the U.S. economy. You see it clearly in steel and aluminum tariffs. You see it in the auto sector. I mean, the U.S. auto sector cannot survive at 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico. I do think at the last minute he's going to back down on some of these things. He says no exemptions. He's ironclad commitment to that, but I don't believe it. I think he'll start making some exemptions. Having said that, what he'll actually do will be bad enough as it is. And the odds of a U.S. recession have gone up for that reason and for other reasons, which I've mentioned, and world recession as well, and inflation at the same time.
Thank you. Brad, parting shot?
Look, the level of uncertainty here is a function of a lack of clarity in Trump's policy. Are the 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada really just about fentanyl? Or are they a long-run effort to undermine Canada's economic sovereignty because we would like Canada to reconsider its political independence? We should know the answer to that question, and I don't think we do. What are reciprocal tariffs conceptually? And how are they going to be applied? And along what time frame? And using what trade tools, what legal authority? The president has talked repeatedly about reciprocal tariffs without laying out what he means. And what he seems to mean is actually not a reciprocal tariff, because we're not going to cut our tariff down on autos from Japan to 0 from 2.5. At least I don't think we are. So what exactly are we going to have reciprocal tariffs against? Is it against VATs? Is it against undervalued currencies? When are those reciprocal tariffs going to be introduced, and under what authority? Businesses need a bit of clarity. Are the reciprocal tariffs going to be the base tariff with fentanyl tariffs on top, with punitive tariffs on China on top, with sectoral tariffs in autos and pharmaceuticals on top, as the president suggested? Are we laying tariff on tariff on tariff, and are we underestimating how high Trump wants the tariffs to go? We should kind of know that answer to that question. And I would like to know, actually, not just the headline budget reconciliation numbers, but what's the specific budget proposal of this administration? What tax cuts are they going to really fight for? What reforms are they going to propose to corporate income tax? And what particular forms of spending, not DOGE, which is arbitrary, capricious, and mostly fake, but what's the real fiscal consolidation, the kind that Congress has to pass, that they want to accompany these tax cuts? It seems to me that this administration has not set forth its economic program, not in any real detail. And so therefore, an enormous level of uncertainty is the outcome.
Thank you. Mark, parting shot.
So, China, I think, poses big issues for the global economy. Others sin, but we are sinners too, sometimes rather significantly. The post-World War II era was a good thing. It wasn't a ripoff. We really should try and fix our own house and focus on what we can do. And meanwhile, tariffs threatening to pull the security umbrella away is creating huge uncertainty, risks for the U.S. and the world that are absolutely not needed.
Thank you. Desmond, you get the last word, of course.
Yeah, I'd just say that I think that the uncertainty is really causing a lot of damage both to the US and global economy as well as to the stock market. And I'd agree that if that uncertainty dissipated, we do have a chance of proceeding in a better fashion. My problem is that Trump 2 is different from Trump 1 in that there are no people around him who are going to restrain him. So I think that we really do have to have some kind of accident in the stock market to get the U-turn. And until that occurs, I think that we're going to have the uncertainty. So I think that it's really going to be a rough ride the next few months.
Thank you. And to all the panelists, thank you for a really knowledgeable, insightful, and terrific discussion. Thanks to our audience and everyone who has been with us. And we are adjourned today. Thank you.